I'm Dr. Amelia Richardson, and I spent 16 years as a hospice physician at Willowbrook End-of-Life Care Center in Burlington, Vermont, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 4 months ago. You can call me Dr. Richardson if you want, though most families just called me their guardian angel during my time there. I've guided over 1,800 people through their final journey from this world, held countless hands during last breaths, and witnessed every conceivable way the human spirit prepares for death. But what I'm about to tell you is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about death, the afterlife, and the mysterious boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond. It's the case that ultimately forced me to abandon hospice medicine entirely and left me questioning the very nature of reality itself. Willowbrook End-of-Life Care Center sits nestled in the Green Mountains of Vermont, serving terminal patients throughout New England. It's a state-of-the-art facility with 40 private rooms, each designed to provide dignity and comfort during humanity's most vulnerable moments. During my 16 years there, I became something of an expert in the medical and psychological patterns that accompany death. Let me be clear about something from the start. I am a woman of science. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School, completed my residency in internal medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, and pursued specialized training in palliative care at Memorial Sloan Kettering. My approach to death has always been clinical, compassionate, but grounded in medical reality. I believe in evidence-based medicine, peer-reviewed research, and the rational explanation of phenomena. In hospice care, we see predictable patterns as people approach death. There are well-documented stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually acceptance. We understand the physiological process of dying, how organs shut down, how circulation fails, how the brain responds to decreased oxygen. We know about terminal lucidity, those surprising moments of clarity that can occur hours or even days before death. We're familiar with death rattles, the distinctive breathing patterns that signal the final hours. Most importantly, we understand the psychological phenomena that accompany dying. Approximately 60% of dying patients report seeing deceased loved ones in their final weeks. They describe conversations with dead parents, spouses, children, or friends. These visions are so common that we have clinical terminology for them: deathbed phenomena, or end-of-life experiences. The medical explanation is straightforward: reduced oxygen to the brain, the effects of pain medications, the psychological need for comfort during trauma, and the brain's natural tendency to create meaningful hallucinations during extreme stress. I had seen these phenomena thousands of times. Patients would tell me about visits from their deceased mothers, conversations with dead husbands, or glimpses of departed children beckoning them towards some peaceful place. Family members often found great comfort in these reports, believing their loved ones were being welcomed by those who had passed before them. I would nod sympathetically, document these experiences in medical charts, and explain to families that such visions were a normal, even healthy part of the dying process. As a physician, I understood these experiences as the brain's way of processing the transition from life to death. They were hallucinations, certainly, but benevolent ones that served an important psychological function. They provided comfort, reduced anxiety, and helped patients approach death with less fear. From a medical standpoint, they were irrelevant to treatment, but valuable for emotional care. This was my worldview for over 15 years of practice: scientific, rational, and comfortingly predictable. Death was a biological process that followed natural laws, and the human brain responded to that process in understandable ways. I was confident in my expertise, satisfied with my ability to help patients and families navigate the most difficult experience of human existence. That confidence would be shattered completely by a 72-year-old retired librarian named Constance Blackwood. Constance arrived at Willowbrook on a cold February morning in 2020, just weeks before the world would change forever with the COVID-19 pandemic. She was 72 years old, Originally from the small Vermont town of Peacham, about an hour northeast of Burlington, she had been battling ovarian cancer for 14 months, and her oncologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, at the University of Vermont Medical Center, had referred her to our facility when chemotherapy was no longer providing meaningful benefit. I remember my first impression of Constance vividly. She was a small woman, perhaps 5 feet 2 inches tall, with silver hair that she kept in an elegant bun despite her illness. Her eyes were a striking pale blue, almost gray, and they held an intelligence and warmth that immediately put people at ease. Even weakened by cancer, she maintained perfect posture and spoke with the precise diction of someone who had spent decades helping people find exactly the right book for their needs. Constance had been the head librarian at Peacham Public Library for 38 years before retiring in 2015. She was widowed. Her husband Thomas had died in a farming accident in 2010, exactly 10 years before her admission to our facility. They had been married for 42 years and had no children, a source of sadness that Constance mentioned during our initial consultation. Her only living family was her sister Margaret, who lived in Montreal and visited as often as her health allowed. What immediately struck me about Constance was her remarkable composure about her diagnosis and prognosis. Most patients arrive at hospice care with varying degrees of fear, anger, or denial about their situation. Constance seemed to have achieved genuine acceptance of her approaching death, but in a way that felt different from other patients I had cared for. During our first meeting, as I was explaining our care philosophy and treatment approach, Constance interrupted me gently. "Dr. Richardson," she said, her voice soft but absolutely certain, "I appreciate everything you're telling me about pain management and comfort care, but I need you to understand something important. My Thomas is coming to get me. He visits me every evening at exactly 8:15, and he's been preparing me for when it's time to go with him. I won't be here very long." I nodded with what I hoped was understanding sympathy. Many of our patients find great comfort in feeling connected to their deceased spouses. Constance's experiences can be very meaningful during this difficult time. Constance looked at me with those pale blue eyes, and I saw something there that made me uncomfortable. Not distress or confusion, but a kind of gentle pity, as if I were a child who didn't yet understand something obvious to adults. "Dr. Richardson," she said quietly, "I'm not talking about feelings or comfort. Thomas comes to visit me. We have conversations. He tells me about where he's been and what he's learned since he died. He's been preparing a place for us, and he gives me updates on when I'll be ready to join him." On Constance's second evening at Willowbrook, I decided to observe her during the time she claimed Thomas visited. I had done this with dozens of patients over the years, partly to understand their psychological needs, and partly to ensure they weren't experiencing distressing hallucinations that required medical intervention. At 8:10 p.m., I positioned myself at the nurse's station, where I had a clear view into Constance's room. She had been resting quietly, occasionally reading from a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice that she'd brought from home. As the digital clock on her bedside table approached 8:15, I watched something remarkable happen. Constance closed her book carefully, marked her place with an old library checkout card she used as a bookmark, and set it aside on her bedside table. She then smoothed her hair, adjusted the collar of her nightgown, and turned toward the chair beside her window with a smile that transformed her entire face. The change was so dramatic that for a moment, she looked decades younger. "Hello, my darling," she said clearly, her voice filled with joy and love. "You look wonderful tonight. Did you have a good day?" For the next 25 minutes, Constance carried on what appeared to be a detailed, intimate conversation with the empty chair. She would speak, then pause and listen intently, occasionally laughing softly or nodding in agreement. Her facial expressions changed throughout the conversation. Sometimes she looked concerned, other times curious, and frequently she displayed the kind of tender affection that comes from decades of shared intimacy. What struck me most was how natural and unforced the conversation appeared. wasn't the disconnected rambling I had observed in patients experiencing medication-induced hallucinations. This wasn't the desperate, grief-stricken pleading I had witnessed in patients struggling with denial about a spouse's death. This was what appeared to be a normal, loving conversation between two people who knew each other intimately. I could hear parts of Constance's side of the conversation from my position at the nurse's station. She talked about her day, the nurses who had cared for her, the meal she'd been served. She asked questions that suggested Thomas was responding with detailed information about his own activities. She even laughed at what appeared to be jokes or amusing stories he was sharing. The conversation always ended the same way. Constance would nod seriously and say, "I understand, Thomas. I'll be patient and wait until you say it's the right time." Then she would blow a kiss toward the chair, say, "I love you too, darling. See you tomorrow evening," and settle back into her bed with an expression of complete contentment. After observing this pattern for 4 consecutive evenings, I became concerned that Constance might be experiencing early signs of terminal delirium or medication-induced hallucinations. While her daytime mental state remained completely sharp, she could discuss literature, current events, and complex philosophical topics with remarkable insight. The consistency and detail of her evening visits seemed unusual, even by hospice standards. I ordered a comprehensive neurological evaluation to rule out any medical causes for hallucinations. Dr. Marcus Webb, our consulting neurologist, examined Constance extensively over 2 days. Her cognitive function tests scored in the 95th percentile for women her age and education level. Her brain MRI showed no signs of metastatic cancer, stroke, or any neurological abnormalities that might cause hallucinations. Blood tests revealed perfectly balanced levels of medications and no metabolic issues that could affect mental state. Constance is experiencing what appears to be isolated evening hallucinations, Dr. Webb concluded in his report. However, her overall cognitive function is exceptional for someone with advanced ovarian cancer. I would classify this as grief-related psychological adaptation rather than medical hallucination. In fact, these experiences seem to be providing her with significant emotional comfort and stability. I also consulted with our staff psychiatrist, Dr. Rachel Martinez, who specialized in end-of-life psychological care. Dr. Martinez spent several hours interviewing Constance about her experiences, her relationship with her deceased husband, and her emotional state. Constance demonstrates no signs of psychiatric illness, depression, or anxiety disorders, Dr. Martinez reported. Her descriptions of interactions with her deceased husband are remarkably detailed and consistent. While these are almost certainly grief-related hallucinations, they appear to be serving a highly adaptive function. She's not distressed by these experiences, quite the opposite. They seem to be providing her with strength and peace as she approaches death. From a medical standpoint, Constance was responding perfectly to palliative care. Her pain was well controlled, she was eating reasonably well despite her advanced cancer, and she remained socially engaged with staff and other patients during the day. The evening conversations with Thomas seemed to be having a positive rather than negative effect on her overall well-being. What began to disturb me about Constance's condition wasn't the fact that she was seeing her deceased husband. As I mentioned, that's quite common in hospice care. What troubled me was the increasingly specific and detailed nature of these conversations, and more importantly, the medical predictions that began emerging from them. Each morning I would check on Constance during my rounds, and she would cheerfully share details from her previous evening's conversation with Thomas. Initially, these seemed like typical grief-related fantasies, discussions about their shared memories, expressions of love and longing, conversations about their life together before his death. But gradually, the content of these conversations became more specific and medically relevant. Constance began reporting that Thomas was giving her detailed information about her physical condition and what to expect as her illness progressed. Thomas says my liver function is going to decline over the next week, she told me, on a Thursday morning in late February. He says you'll notice changes in my blood work by Monday, and you might want to adjust my nausea medication. I made a note of this prediction, but didn't think much of it at the time. Patients with advanced cancer often become very attuned to changes in their bodies, and it wouldn't be unusual for someone to sense approaching complications. But when Constance's liver function tests on Monday showed exactly the decline she had predicted, I started paying closer attention to what she claimed Thomas was telling her. He's very impressed with Nurse Jennifer's technique with IVs, Constance mentioned the following week. He says she has a natural gift for finding veins, even difficult ones. He also wanted me to tell you that Mr. Patterson, in room 23, is going to have a difficult night on Wednesday, something about his breathing. Thomas says you should check on him around 3 a.m. I was puzzled by the specificity of this information. Constance had no medical training beyond basic first aid, and she had never interacted with Mr. Patterson, who was in the advanced stages of lung cancer and rarely left his room. But on Wednesday night, Mr. Patterson did indeed experience severe respiratory distress at approximately 2:45 a.m., requiring emergency intervention and additional medication. The predictions became more frequent and more accurate. Constance would report conversations in which Thomas apparently discussed other patients' conditions, predicted equipment failures, and even provided insights into staff scheduling issues that he couldn't possibly have knowledge of. Thomas mentioned that the main elevator is going to break down on Friday morning. Constance told me on a Wednesday. He says it's something with the motor, and it will take most of the weekend to repair. He suggests you warn housekeeping so they can plan around it. I dismissed this as coincidence until Friday morning, when the main elevator stopped working due to motor failure, exactly as Constance had predicted. Maintenance confirmed that the repairs would take the entire weekend. What happened on March 8, 2020, would fundamentally challenge everything I thought I knew about death, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. It was a Sunday evening, and I was working late, catching up on patient charts and medication reviews. As I passed Constance's room around 8:30 p.m., I noticed she was still engaged in her evening conversation with Thomas. "Yes, I understand," I heard her saying. "Dr. Richardson does work very hard. She cares deeply about all of us." I paused outside her doorway, curious about why I was being discussed in her conversation with Thomas. "Oh, she's here now," Constance said, turning toward the doorway where I stood. "Thomas, Dr. Richardson is right outside." "Yes, I'll tell her." Constance looked directly at me with those pale blue eyes. "Dr. Richardson, could you come in for a moment? Thomas has something he'd like me to share with you." I entered the room, feeling somewhat awkward about intruding on what I understood to be a private, albeit hallucinatory, conversation. Constance gestured toward the chair where she claimed Thomas was sitting. "Thomas wants you to know that your mother is doing very well," Constance said, her voice gentle but serious. "He says she's been watching you work here, and she's incredibly proud of the compassion you show to patients and families. She wanted you to know that the decision you made about her treatment was exactly right, and she holds no resentment about the end-of-life care decisions you made on her behalf." I felt the blood drain from my face. My mother had died 3 years earlier from complications of Alzheimer's disease. In her final months, when she was no longer able to make decisions for herself, I had chosen to transition her to hospice care, rather than continue aggressive medical interventions. It had been an agonizing decision, and one that I had questioned constantly since her death. The guilt about giving up on her had haunted me, despite my professional understanding that I had made the medically and ethically appropriate choice. More importantly, I had never discussed my mother's death, or my feelings about it with anyone at Willowbrook. My colleagues knew she had died, but I had kept the details and my emotional struggles completely private. Thomas also says, Constance continued, apparently listening to something I couldn't hear, that your mother wants you to stop carrying guilt about the morphine dosage in her final days. She says you gave her exactly the comfort she needed, and she passed peacefully because of your love and medical expertise. The morphine dosage issue was something even more private. In my mother's final 48 hours, I had authorized increased pain medication that would ensure her comfort, but might also hasten her death. It's a common and medically appropriate decision in end-of-life care, but it had been a source of profound personal anguish for me. I had wondered if I was ending my mother's life rather than simply managing her pain. No one at Willowbrook knew about this internal struggle. I had never discussed it with colleagues, friends, or even my therapist. There was simply no way Constance could have known about my mother's death, the circumstances of her care, or my feelings about the decisions I had made. Over the following week, Thomas apparently had much more to share through Constance, not just about me, but about other staff members and patients throughout the facility. The information was consistently accurate and consistently impossible for Constance to have known through any normal means. She told Nurse Jennifer that her father, who had died in Vietnam, was proud of her military service and wanted her to know that his letters to her mother, which had been lost in a house fire, expressed his hope that Jennifer would pursue nursing. Jennifer confirmed that she had indeed lost her father's letters in a fire, and had become a nurse partly because of his encouragement in letters she could no longer read. Constance shared information about Dr. Martinez's son, who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. According to Thomas, the son wanted his mother to know that his death had been instantaneous and painless, contrary to the medical examiner's report that had caused Dr. Martinez years of anguish about his suffering. This information provided Dr. Martinez with comfort she had been seeking through therapy for half a decade. Most remarkably, Thomas began providing medical insights about other patients that proved consistently accurate. He would describe internal conditions that hadn't yet been diagnosed, predict complications before they became apparent, and suggest treatment modifications that proved beneficial. Mrs. Chen in room 17 is developing a blood clot in her left leg, Constance reported on a Tuesday morning. Thomas says it's still small, but Dr. Richardson should order an ultrasound by Thursday to catch it before it becomes dangerous. I had seen no clinical signs of blood clots in Mrs. Chen, but decided to order the ultrasound based on Constance's report. We found exactly what Thomas had described, a small but significant clot that would have become life-threatening if left untreated. As March progressed and Constance's condition gradually declined, the conversations with Thomas became even more detailed and medically sophisticated. He was apparently providing information about optimal medication dosages, predicting patient responses to treatments, and even diagnosing conditions in patients that our medical team hadn't yet identified. Thomas says Mr. Rodriguez is developing an infection at his surgical site, Constance told me on a Wednesday. He can see bacteria gathering there, even though it's not visible on the surface yet. He suggests you might want to start preventive antibiotics before the infection becomes serious. Mr. Rodriguez had undergone minor surgery to insert a feeding tube 3 days earlier. The surgical site looked completely normal, no redness, swelling, or other signs of infection, but I decided to order blood tests and cultures based on Constance's report. Within 24 hours, we detected early signs of bacterial infection that would have become serious if not caught early. I began keeping detailed notes of Thomas's predictions and insights, cross-referencing them with actual medical outcomes. Over the course of 3 weeks, his accuracy rate was over 95%, measured better than most diagnostic equipment, and far superior to what chance would predict. The most unsettling aspect of these revelations wasn't their accuracy, but their scope. Thomas was apparently able to see and understand things that were happening throughout the entire facility, not just in Constance's room. He would report on conversations between staff members that took place in different parts of the building. He would describe the emotional states of patients he had never met. He even predicted staffing changes and administrative decisions that hadn't yet been announced.
Thomas says Dr. Webb is going to accept a position at Mayo Clinic, Constance mentioned casually during one of our morning conversations.
He hasn't told anyone yet, but he received the offer yesterday and will accept it next week. Dr. Webb had indeed received an offer from Mayo Clinic, which he confided to me privately 3 days later, before accepting the position and giving notice to Willowbrook. By early April 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to affect our operations at Willowbrook, I found myself in a profound professional and personal crisis. Every rational part of my medical training told me that what I was witnessing with Constance was impossible. Dead people don't provide medical diagnoses. Hallucinations don't predict future events with scientific accuracy. The consciousness of deceased individuals doesn't interact with the physical world to provide information that living people cannot access. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Thomas, through Constance, was consistently providing information that proved accurate, helpful, and impossible to obtain through normal means. He was making medical predictions that saved lives, offering emotional comfort to grieving families, and demonstrating knowledge that no living person possessed. I began spending longer periods observing Constance's evening conversations with Thomas. I started recording detailed notes about every prediction and piece of information that emerged from these interactions. I consulted with colleagues at other hospitals, researched similar cases in medical literature, and even reached out to researchers studying near-death experiences and consciousness. Nothing in my medical education or professional experience had prepared me for what I was witnessing. The scientific worldview that had guided my career for 16 years was being systematically dismantled by a 72-year-old retired librarian who spoke with her dead husband every evening at 8:15 p.m. More disturbing than the impossible nature of these interactions was their increasing intensity. Thomas was apparently preparing Constance for something significant, and her physical condition was declining more rapidly than her cancer prognosis would predict. Despite optimal palliative care, she was losing weight, sleeping more, and showing signs that her death was approaching sooner than expected. Thomas says it's almost time, Constance told me on a Thursday morning in mid-April. He's been preparing our new home, and everything is ready now. He just needs to make sure a few more people here receive the messages they need before we go together. During the last week of April 2020, Constance's conversations with Thomas took on an urgency and specificity that was both beautiful and terrifying. According to Constance, Thomas was working to deliver final messages to several staff members and patients before it was time for her to join him permanently. These messages were profoundly personal and impossible for Constance to have known. Thomas apparently told Nurse Jennifer about her father's final thoughts before dying in Vietnam, specific details about his love for her and her mother that brought Jennifer to tears. He shared information with Dr. Martinez about her son's state of mind in his final moments, providing the peace she had been seeking for years. Most remarkably, Thomas began providing what could only be described as medical miracles. He guided Constance to share specific treatment recommendations that led to unexpected improvements in several patients' conditions. A patient with terminal brain cancer experienced a sudden remission after medications were adjusted according to Thomas's suggestions. A woman with end-stage heart failure stabilized dramatically when her care was modified based on his insights. Thomas wants you to know, Constance told me on her final Thursday, that death isn't what any of us think it is. Consciousness doesn't end when the body stops functioning. Love doesn't disappear when physical presence is gone. The connections between people, especially between people who have loved deeply, continue in ways that science doesn't yet understand. She paused, listening to something I couldn't hear, then continued. He also wants you to know that you've been chosen to witness this because you have the medical expertise to document it properly. Someone needs to tell people that the boundary between life and death isn't as absolute as we believe. On Friday, April 28, 2020, at exactly 8:15 p.m., I watched Constance have her final conversation with Thomas. From my position at the nurse's station, I could see her sitting up in bed, facing the chair by her window, her face illuminated with joy and anticipation. "Yes, Thomas," I heard her say clearly, "I'm ready now. I understand everything you've taught me, and I'm not afraid." She paused, listening, then laughed with delight. "Our new home sounds wonderful, darling. Yes, I'm ready to come with you." Constance turned toward the doorway, where I stood watching, and gave me a gentle wave. "Thank you for taking such good care of me, Dr. Richardson. Thomas says you'll understand everything soon enough." She settled back into her pillows, closed her eyes with a peaceful smile, and died quietly at 8:47 p.m., 32 minutes after her final conversation with Thomas began. Her death should have ended this extraordinary case. Instead, it marked the beginning of the most disturbing experience of my medical career. Within hours of Constance's death, something unprecedented began happening at Willowbrook. The phenomena didn't disappear, it intensified and spread throughout our entire facility. At 11:30 p.m. that same night, Nurse Jennifer approached me with a disturbed expression. "Dr. Richardson, Mr. Patterson just sat up and said, 'The lady from room 12 wants you to know your father says hello. He's proud of how you honored his memory by serving in medicine.'" This was impossible. Mr. Patterson had been barely conscious for days, hadn't spoken coherently in a week, and had never interacted with Constance. Yet the message was perfectly accurate. Jennifer had chosen nursing to honor her father's memory, something only Thomas had known through his conversations with Constance. Over the next 48 hours, patients throughout Willowbrook began delivering specific messages they claimed were from Constance and Thomas. Mrs. Chen told Dr. Martinez that the librarian lady said her deceased son had left a letter hidden behind his yearbooks. Dr. Martinez found exactly what was described, a Mother's Day letter she thought was lost forever. The medical predictions continued with impossible accuracy. The librarian told me, "My kidneys will start failing tomorrow morning," reported Mr. Williams on Tuesday evening. His kidney function tests the next morning showed exactly the decline Constance had predicted. As a physician, I felt compelled to investigate rigorously. I contacted Dr. Elena Vasquez, a consciousness researcher at Stanford University, who conducted a 2-week investigation of our facility. "Dr. Richardson," she concluded, "what you're documenting is unprecedented. The consistency and accuracy of these communications goes far beyond anything in the literature on end-of-life experiences. While I can't explain the mechanism, your evidence is compelling and well documented." Dr. James Morrison, a psychiatrist specializing in grief, spent a week interviewing our patients and staff. His conclusion was equally puzzling. These patients aren't experiencing typical hallucinations. They're reporting complex communications that provide accurate information no living person could possess. This doesn't fit any known diagnostic category. Over 3 weeks, I documented over 40 instances of patients reporting contact with Constance and Thomas, with 97% accuracy for medical predictions and 100% accuracy for verifiable personal information. As May progressed, I confronted a fundamental crisis of faith in the scientific worldview that had guided my career. Everything I understood about consciousness, death, and reality was being challenged by daily experiences that defied rational explanation. I began having difficulty functioning as a hospice physician. During family consultations about end-of-life care, I found myself wondering whether their loved ones might be more aware and present than medical science suggested. When patients reported seeing deceased relatives, I could no longer dismiss these experiences as mere hallucinations. The weight of these questions was making traditional medical practice impossible for me. How could I provide definitive guidance about death when I was no longer certain about its nature? On May 23, 2020, something happened that completely shattered my remaining faith in conventional medicine. I was working late when I heard my name being called from room 12, Constance's former room, which had been empty since her death. "Dr. Richardson, could you please come to room 12? I have something important to share with you." The voice was unmistakably Constance's distinctive librarian's diction. Against every rational instinct, I walked to the empty room and stood in the doorway. "Thank you for coming," I heard Constance's voice say, though I saw no one. "Thomas and I wanted to speak with you directly." For 20 minutes, I had what I can only describe as a conversation with Constance and Thomas. They thanked me for the care I had provided and explained that death was a transition rather than an ending. Most importantly, they told me my role at Willowbrook was complete. "You can no longer practice hospice medicine with uncertainty about the nature of death," Constance said clearly. "You've seen the truth now, and it will make traditional medical practice impossible for you. Your calling is to help others understand what you've learned." By the time I left Willowbrook that night, I knew my career in hospice medicine was over. How could I continue practicing within a framework I no longer believed accurately described reality? Over the next month, I completed my patient responsibilities and prepared my resignation. I spent my final weeks documenting everything I had witnessed, organizing notes and observations into a comprehensive report. The phenomena at Willowbrook continued even after my departure. According to Dr. Martinez, who took over my responsibilities, patients kept reporting visits from Constance and Thomas for months. The messages became less frequent but maintained their characteristic accuracy. More remarkably, the entire atmosphere at Willowbrook changed. Patients approached death with less fear, families found more peace in their grief, and staff felt more purposeful in their work. "It's as if Constance and Thomas left us with a gift," Dr. Martinez told me. "Death doesn't feel like the enemy here anymore." After leaving Willowbrook, I spent months researching consciousness studies and near-death experience research. I discovered that while my experiences were unusual in scope, they weren't entirely without precedent. Researchers like Dr. Raymond Moody and Dr. Eben Alexander have documented similar challenges to our understanding of consciousness and death. I realized that leaving traditional medicine didn't mean abandoning healing. Instead, it meant finding new ways to support people through life's most profound transitions and mysteries. Today, I work as a private consultant, helping families navigate the emotional and spiritual aspects of serious illness and end-of-life transitions. I use my medical training to help people understand their options while sharing what I learned about the potential continuation of consciousness beyond physical death. The case of Constance Blackwood and Thomas taught me that reality is more mysterious and wonderful than medical science currently acknowledges. Their story showed me that death might not be the ending we fear, but a transformation into forms of existence we don't yet comprehend. Most importantly, they proved that love transcends death. The connection between Constance and Thomas, refined by 42 years of marriage, didn't end when Thomas died in 2010, and it didn't end when Constance died in 2020. Their relationship continued in ways that brought healing and impossible knowledge to everyone they touched. I left hospice medicine because witnessing the impossible made traditional practice impossible for me. But I don't regret the experience. Constance and Thomas gave me the greatest gift any patients had ever offered me: proof that death is not the enemy, and that love is stronger than the grave. The case that made me question everything I knew about death ultimately taught me the most important truth of my career. Consciousness is more mysterious, love is more powerful, and reality is more wonderful than medical science currently understands. Constance and Thomas are still together, somewhere beyond our comprehension, and because of what they shared, dozens of patients and families found peace in their transitions from this world to whatever lies beyond. That's not a medical outcome you can measure in clinical trials, but it's the most important healing I was ever privileged to witness.